My 9-year-old twins' dance teacher was grooming them to hate me and planning to take them away. He gave them secret notebooks, showed up at our house unannounced, and I later found out he was a serial predator. I'm a 34-year-old divorced mother of twin daughters, Edith and Hannah, both 9. After my divorce 2 years ago, I moved to a small town about 3 hours from where we used to live. My ex-husband lives in another state and only sees the girls during summer break and some holidays. The move was necessary because I got a job at the local hospital as a nurse, and the cost of living here is much lower than the city. When we first moved here, the girls had trouble adjusting. They missed their old friends and complained about everything being different. I enrolled them in various activities to help them make new friends and feel more settled. One of these activities was dance classes at a local studio called Harmony Dance Academy. The owner and main instructor is a man named David Lee, 42M. When I first met him, he seemed perfect for the job. He had been running the studio for 8 years and had excellent reviews from other parents. David is energetic, patient with the kids, and genuinely talented. The girls took to him immediately, which made me happy since they had been resistant to most other activities. David teaches multiple styles including ballet, jazz, and contemporary dance. He also speaks Mandarin Chinese, which he mentioned during our first meeting. I speak Mandarin fluently because I studied abroad in Taiwan during college and later worked for a company that did business in China. However, I never mentioned this to David because the conversation moved on to other topics and it didn't seem relevant at the time. For the first few months, everything seemed great. The girls loved their dance classes and would practice at home constantly. David would send progress videos to parents and was always available to answer questions about upcoming recitals or competitions. He even offered to give the girls extra practice time after regular classes ended, which I thought was generous since many instructors charge extra for individual attention. The problem started around month 4. David began making comments about my parenting during pickup and drop-off times. At first, these were subtle suggestions disguised as helpful advice. He would mention that the girls seemed tired and perhaps they needed earlier bedtimes. He suggested I pack different snacks because what I was giving them wasn't providing enough energy for dance. When I dressed them in certain outfits, he would comment that other parents dress their children more appropriately for dance class. I initially brushed off these comments because I thought he was just passionate about his students' success. However, the suggestions became more frequent and more specific. David started questioning my decisions about the girls' hair, their shoes, even what time I picked them up from school on dance days. He would phrase these as concerned observations rather than direct criticism, but the message was clear that he thought I wasn't doing things correctly. The breaking point came when David suggested that I was too strict with the girls and that they needed more freedom to express themselves artistically. This happened in front of other parents, which embarrassed me. I told him politely but firmly that I appreciated his concern but that parenting decisions were mine to make. David immediately backtracked and apologized, saying he only wanted what was best for Edith and Hannah because he cared about them so much. After that conversation, David's behavior changed. He became overly friendly and began sharing personal information that seemed designed to make me feel sorry for him. He told me about his divorce 5 years earlier and how his ex-wife had moved across the country with their son, making it impossible for him to maintain a relationship with the child. He said working with kids at the dance studio helped fill the void left by losing access to his own son. This explanation made me feel guilty for confronting him earlier, which I now realize was exactly what he intended. David started offering to watch the girls outside of regular class time, saying he understood how difficult it was to be a single parent and that he was happy to help however he could. He would text me directly instead of using the studio's group messaging system, and these texts often came late at night or early in the morning. Meanwhile, I began noticing changes in Edith and Hannah's behavior at home. They started questioning rules they had never challenged before. When I told them to clean their rooms, they would mention that David said creative people shouldn't be constrained by too much structure. When I limited their screen time, they would bring up conversations with David about the importance of modern technology and artistic expression. These references to David became constant. Every disagreement or discipline issue somehow connected back to something David had told them. The girls began spending more time talking about David than about their friends, their school, or even their father. They would repeat his opinions about movies, food, music, and even current events that seemed inappropriate for 9-year-olds to discuss. The situation escalated when David started communicating directly with the girls through a messaging app on the studio's tablet, which parents were told was only for scheduling purposes. I discovered this when Hannah accidentally showed me a message thread where David was asking about their weekend plans and what they had eaten for breakfast that morning. When I asked Hannah about it, she said David had told them this was normal and that all his favorite students got to message him directly. I immediately contacted David and told him that all communication needed to go through me, not directly to the children. He apologized and said he hadn't realized it would be a problem, claiming he was just trying to maintain the mentor-student relationship outside of class time. He assured me it wouldn't happen again and said he would delete the messaging thread. However, I noticed that the girls continued to reference recent conversations with David, which meant the direct communication was continuing somehow. When I asked them about it, they became evasive and said they couldn't remember exactly when or where they had talked to him. This was unusual because Edith and Hannah typically shared every detail of their day with me. The girls also started making comments that seemed designed to test my reactions. They would mention how David said that the best dancers came from families where parents fully supported their artistic development without interference. They talked about other students whose parents let them attend extra workshops and competitions that I had said were too expensive for our budget. Last month, things reached a new level when David offered to take Edith and Hannah to a dance competition in the state capital. This would involve an overnight stay at a hotel, and David suggested the girls could share a room with 2 other students while he stayed in an adjacent room. He presented this as a common arrangement and showed me photos from previous competitions with other students. I declined this offer, explaining that I wasn't comfortable with overnight trips yet since we were still relatively new to the studio. David's reaction was immediate and intense. He told me I was holding the girls back from opportunities that could advance their dance careers. He said other parents would jump at the chance for their children to attend such a prestigious competition. When I remained firm in my decision, David asked if he could speak with me privately after the next class. During that conversation, he told me that Edith and Hannah had confided in him about feeling restricted at home. He claimed they had expressed frustration that I didn't understand their passion for dance the way he did. David said he was only trying to provide the support and encouragement they weren't getting from their family. This conversation left me confused and hurt. I had always been supportive of the girls' interests and had made significant financial sacrifices to pay for dance classes, costumes, and shoes. I couldn't understand why they would complain to David about feeling unsupported, especially since they had never expressed these feelings to me directly. That night, I asked Edith and Hannah about their conversation with David. They initially denied saying anything negative about our home life, but when I pressed for details, they admitted that David had asked them specific questions about rules in our house and how they felt about various restrictions. They said he had explained that sometimes parents don't realize when they're being too controlling and that it was normal for children to feel more understood by their teachers than by their families. I realized then that David had been systematically gathering information about our family dynamics and using that information to position himself as the more understanding and supportive adult in their lives. The girls weren't spontaneously complaining about me to David. He was asking leading questions designed to elicit responses he could then use to justify his interference. I decided to remove Edith and Hannah from David's classes immediately. When I called the studio to cancel their enrollment, David asked if he could call me to discuss my concerns. During that phone call, he became defensive and accused me of overreacting to normal mentor-student relationships. He said I was depriving the girls of important opportunities because of my own insecurities as a parent. David then made a comment that chilled me. He said that Edith and Hannah were talented enough to have real futures in dance, but only if they had adults in their lives who truly understood and supported their potential. He said it would be unfortunate if my limitations as a parent prevented them from achieving their dreams. The girls were devastated when I told them they wouldn't be returning to dance class. They cried and begged me to reconsider, saying David was the best teacher they had ever had and that I was ruining everything for them. Their reaction was so extreme that I started questioning whether I had made the right decision. But then something happened that confirmed my instincts were correct. 3 days after I pulled the girls from classes, David showed up at our house unannounced. He said he had been in the neighborhood and wanted to check on Edith and Hannah because he was worried about them. He asked if he could speak with them for just a few minutes to say goodbye properly. I told David that his visit was inappropriate and that any future communication needed to be in writing through official channels if necessary. He became agitated and said I was being unreasonable and harmful to the girls' emotional well-being. He claimed they had been texting him asking when they could come back to class, which was impossible since I had taken away their devices. David's visit lasted less than 5 minutes, but it showed me that his interest in my daughters went far beyond normal teacher-student boundaries. The fact that he came to our home without permission and lied about the girls contacting him made it clear that his behavior was escalating rather than stopping. Now I'm second-guessing everything that happened over the past several months. I keep wondering what else David might have said or done that I didn't know about, and whether there were other warning signs I missed. The girls are still upset about leaving dance class, and I'm not sure how to help them understand why it was necessary without completely destroying their trust in adults. I need advice on whether I should report David's behavior to someone, and if so, who would be the appropriate authority. I also don't know how to handle the situation with Edith and Hannah, who seemed to blame me for ending something that was important to them. Has anyone else dealt with a situation like this where a teacher or coach became inappropriately involved in their family dynamics? Update 1. Thank you to everyone who commented on my original post. The support and advice helped me realize that my instincts about David were correct, and that I needed to take additional steps to protect Edith and Hannah. After reading the responses, I decided to document everything I could remember about David's behavior and comments. I wrote down dates, times, and exact quotes whenever possible. I also went through my phone and saved all the text messages he had sent me, including the ones that came at inappropriate hours. While I was going through these messages, I noticed something I had missed before. In several texts, David had included details about our daily routine that I had never shared with him. He knew what time the girls got home from school, what we usually had for dinner on certain days, and even mentioned seeing our car at specific locations around town on weekends. This discovery made me realize that David had been paying much closer attention to our family than I had understood. I started thinking about all the times he had made casual comments about our activities or schedule, and I now see that he had been gathering information systematically rather than just making polite conversation. I decided to contact other parents from the dance studio to see if anyone else had experienced similar issues with David. I was careful not to make direct accusations, but instead asked general questions about their experiences and whether their children had ever mentioned David giving advice about family matters. The responses I received were eye-opening. 3 other mothers told me about concerning interactions they had had with David, though none had escalated to the level of what my family experienced. One woman said David had criticized her decision to limit her daughter's dance schedule because of other commitments. Another mentioned that he had suggested her son might be happier if she was less involved in monitoring his progress. Most disturbing was a conversation I had with Rebecca Martinez, whose daughter had been enrolled at the studio 2 years ago. Rebecca told me that David had convinced her daughter that she had exceptional talent and needed more intensive training than the regular classes provided. He offered private lessons at reduced rates and suggested that Rebecca's work schedule was interfering with her daughter's potential success. Rebecca said the private lessons started normally, but David began asking her daughter personal questions about home life and encouraging her to share any frustrations she had with family rules or expectations. He told the girl that artistic people often felt misunderstood by their families and that it was normal to feel closer to mentors who truly appreciated their talents. The situation ended when Rebecca's daughter asked if she could spend a weekend at David's house so she could practice more intensively without household distractions. When Rebecca questioned this request, David called her directly and said she was holding her daughter back from opportunities that could change the girl's life. Rebecca immediately removed her daughter from the studio and enrolled her elsewhere. Rebecca also told me something that made my blood run cold. She said that after she pulled her daughter from classes, David had shown up at their house twice. The first time, he claimed he was returning some of the girl's personal items that had been left at the studio. The second time, he said he had been driving by and noticed their car wasn't in the driveway, so he wanted to make sure everything was okay. Rebecca had not reported these incidents to anyone at the time because David's explanation seemed plausible, and she was focused on helping her daughter adjust to a new dance studio. However, hearing about my experience made her realize that David's behavior had been inappropriate and potentially dangerous. Armed with this information, I decided to contact the local police to file a report about David's unannounced visit to our house. The officer I spoke with was very professional and took detailed notes about the timeline of events. He explained that while David's actions didn't necessarily constitute criminal behavior yet, having an official record would be important if the situation escalated further. The officer also suggested I contact the studio's landlord and any local business licensing authorities to report my concerns. He said that even if criminal charges weren't warranted, there might be other ways to ensure David's behavior was monitored or restricted. Meanwhile, Edith and Hannah were still struggling with the transition away from dance class. They continued to ask when they could go back, and they frequently mentioned missing David and the other students. I enrolled them in gymnastics classes at a different facility, but they complained that it wasn't the same and that their new instructor didn't understand them the way David had. The girls' reactions bothered me more than I initially admitted. They seemed genuinely convinced that David had been a positive influence in their lives, and they couldn't understand why I was preventing them from continuing their relationship with him. This made me question whether David had said or done things during their time together that I still didn't know about. I decided to ask Edith and Hannah some direct questions about their interactions with David, being careful not to lead them toward any particular answers. I asked them to tell me about their favorite memories from dance class and what kinds of conversations they had had with David outside of instruction time. What they told me was deeply troubling, though they clearly didn't understand why. David had regularly asked them about their father and why he didn't live with us. He had told them that divorce was often hardest on children because parents become too focused on their own problems to pay attention to what their kids really needed. David had also shared details about his own childhood, telling the girls that his parents had never supported his interest in dance and that he had promised himself he would always encourage young dancers to pursue their dreams no matter what obstacles they faced. He said sometimes the people who love you most are the ones who hold you back because they don't understand your potential. The girls told me that David had explained how dance could be their ticket to a different kind of life, one where they would be appreciated for their talents and surrounded by people who truly understood artistic expression. He had shown them videos of professional dancers and talked about the opportunities that could be available to them if they continued training seriously. Most concerning was Hannah's casual mention that David had told them secrets were sometimes necessary to protect special relationships. He had explained that some adults get jealous when children form strong bonds with teachers or mentors, and that sometimes it was better not to share every detail of their conversations to avoid causing unnecessary drama. When I asked what kinds of secrets David had meant, both girls became evasive and said they couldn't remember exactly. However, Hannah did mention that David had given them each a small notebook where they could write down their thoughts about dance and their dreams for the future. He had told them these notebooks were private and that they should keep them in their backpacks rather than leaving them at home where they might get lost. I asked to see these notebooks, and after some resistance, the girls showed them to me. The notebooks contained writing prompts that David had given them, with questions like what would you change about your family if you could? And who do you trust most to help you achieve your dreams? The girls had filled several pages with answers to these prompts, and their responses made it clear that David's influence had been much deeper than I had realized. Edith had written that she wished her mother understood dance the way David did, and that she sometimes felt like I didn't want her to be successful. Hannah had written that David was the first adult who had ever really listened to her ideas and taken her seriously as a person rather than just treating her like a little kid. Reading these notebooks was heartbreaking, but it also confirmed that David had been deliberately working to undermine their relationship with me while positioning himself as their primary source of support and understanding. The writing prompts were clearly designed to elicit responses that would reinforce his narrative about family dynamics and his special role in their lives. I made copies of the notebooks before returning them to the girls, and I added this evidence to the file I was building about David's behavior. I also scheduled appointments with the girls' school counselor to discuss the situation and get professional advice about how to help them process what had happened. The school counselor was very helpful and provided me with resources about recognizing and responding to inappropriate adult-child relationships. She also offered to speak with Edith and Hannah individually to assess whether they needed additional support or intervention. 2 days after my meeting with the school counselor, I received a text message from David. The message said he had heard that I was spreading rumors about him to other parents and school officials, and that he was disappointed I had chosen to handle our disagreement in such a destructive way. He said he hoped I would reconsider my approach before I damaged his reputation and livelihood over a simple misunderstanding. I did not respond to this message, but I forwarded it to the police officer who had taken my initial report. He told me that David's knowledge about my conversations with the school counselor was concerning, and he suggested I be extra vigilant about monitoring who I shared information with and whether anyone seemed to be watching our daily activities. This advice turned out to be important, because 2 days later, Hannah told me that she had seen David's car parked across the street from her school during dismissal time. She said he had waved at her through the car window but hadn't approached or tried to talk to her. When I asked Hannah why she hadn't mentioned this immediately, she said she didn't think it was important and that David had probably just been in the neighborhood. I immediately called the school to report this incident and asked them to add David's name and description to their list of people who should not have contact with my children on school property. I also called the police to update my report with this new information. The officer I spoke with said that David's presence near the school, combined with his text message and previous unannounced visit to our house, was creating a pattern of behavior that could justify more serious intervention. He said they would increase patrols in our neighborhood and around the girls' school, and that I should call immediately if David made any further contact attempts. Update 2: The situation with David has escalated in ways I never could have anticipated. What started as inappropriate boundary crossing has evolved into something much more serious, and I now understand that my initial concerns were just the beginning of a much larger problem. 3 weeks ago, I received a call from Child Protective Services saying they had received an anonymous report expressing concerns about Edith and Hannah's well-being. The caller had allegedly provided specific details about our home environment and daily routines, claiming the girls were being emotionally neglected and isolated from positive influences in their lives. The CPS worker who contacted me was professional but thorough in her questioning. She asked about the girls' recent behavioral changes, their involvement in extracurricular activities, and why they had been withdrawn from dance classes. She also inquired about my support system and whether the girls had regular contact with other family members or trusted adults. During this conversation, I realized that many of the details mentioned in the anonymous report could only have been known by someone who had extensive information about our family dynamics. The caller had specifically mentioned that the girls had been forced to leave an activity they loved, that they seemed withdrawn and unhappy at school, and that I appeared to be struggling with single parenthood. I immediately suspected David was behind this report, but I had no way to prove it. I provided the CPS worker with documentation about David's behavior, including the text messages, my police reports, and copies of the notebooks he had given the girls. I also gave her contact information for Rebecca Martinez and the other parents who had shared their experiences with David. The CPS investigation required me to allow a home visit and interviews with Edith and Hannah. During the interviews, both girls were asked about their feelings about leaving dance class and whether they felt safe and supported at home. Their answers revealed how deeply David's influence had affected their perception of our family situation. Edith told the CPS worker that she missed her dance teacher very much and didn't understand why she couldn't see him anymore. She said dance class had been the happiest part of her week and that she felt like she didn't have anything to look forward to now. Hannah said she wished adults would listen to kids more and let them make their own decisions about who they wanted to spend time with. While their responses weren't explicitly critical of me, they painted a picture of children who felt restricted and unhappy, which aligned perfectly with the concerns raised in the anonymous report. The CPS worker explained that she would need to complete her investigation before closing the case, and that this process could take several weeks. Meanwhile, I continued documenting any unusual incidents or attempted contact from David. 2 weeks after the CPS call, I discovered that someone had been going through our mail. Several pieces of mail were missing from our mailbox, including bank statements and medical bills that contained personal information about our family. I reported this to the Postal Service and the police, but there was no direct evidence connecting David to the mail theft. However, the timing seemed suspicious given everything else that had been happening. I started having our mail held at the post office and picked it up personally rather than leaving it vulnerable in our mailbox. Around the same time, Edith came home from school with a story that initially seemed innocuous but became more concerning upon reflection. She said a substitute teacher had asked her specific questions about her home life and hobbies during lunch period. The substitute had shown particular interest when Edith mentioned that she used to take dance classes, and had asked why she wasn't dancing anymore. When I contacted the school to inquire about this substitute teacher, they told me that no substitute had been assigned to Edith's class that day, and that all their regular substitutes were accounted for. The description Edith provided didn't match any of their approved substitute teachers, which meant someone had somehow gained access to the school and approached my daughter under false pretenses. The school immediately implemented additional security measures and reported the incident to local authorities. They also arranged for Edith to meet with the school counselor to discuss the interaction and ensure she understood the importance of reporting any similar incidents immediately. This incident made me realize that David's behavior was becoming increasingly bold and potentially dangerous. He was no longer simply showing up at locations where we might be, but was actively seeking opportunities to interact with the girls despite my clear boundaries and the ongoing investigations. I decided to consult with an attorney to understand my legal options for protecting Edith and Hannah from further contact attempts. The attorney explained that I could petition for a restraining order, but that the evidence would need to clearly demonstrate a pattern of harassment or threatening behavior. While we were preparing the restraining order petition, I received another piece of disturbing information. Rebecca Martinez called to tell me that David had contacted her daughter through social media, despite the fact that her daughter was now enrolled at a different dance studio and hadn't had contact with David for over 2 years. David had sent the girl a friend request on Instagram along with a message asking how her dance training was progressing and whether she was happy at her new studio. He mentioned that he often thought about his former students and wondered if they were reaching their full potential in their new environments. Rebecca's daughter had immediately told her mother about the contact attempt, and Rebecca had blocked David from all her daughter's social media accounts. However, this incident showed that David was actively seeking ways to maintain connections with former students, which suggested his interest in children extended beyond the normal bounds of professional relationships. Rebecca and I decided to contact other parents whose children had previously been enrolled at David's studio to warn them about his behavior and ask if they had experienced any unusual contact attempts. Through this informal network, we discovered that at least 2 other families had received unexpected visits or phone calls from David in recent months. One mother told us that David had called to ask if her son might be interested in participating in a summer dance intensive program. When she declined, David had pressed for details about why the family had chosen to discontinue dance lessons and whether they had found the support they needed elsewhere. Another parent said David had approached her at a grocery store and struck up a conversation about her daughter's progress and other activities. He had seemed to know details about the girl's current schedule and interests that the mother couldn't remember sharing with him when they had been enrolled at his studio. These incidents created a clear pattern of David maintaining inappropriate interest in former students and their families long after professional relationships had ended. Combined with his behavior toward my family, this information strengthened our case for legal intervention. The attorney filed our restraining order petition, and we were granted a temporary order pending a full hearing. The temporary order prohibited David from contacting Edith, Hannah, or me directly or indirectly, and required him to stay at least 500 feet away from our home, the girls' school, and any other locations we regularly frequented. However, serving David with the restraining order proved more complicated than expected. When the sheriff's deputy went to the dance studio, they found it closed with a sign saying it was temporarily shut down for renovations. David's apartment was also empty, and neighbors said they hadn't seen him for several days. The deputy was eventually able to serve the papers by leaving them with David's landlord, who confirmed that David had given notice and moved out without providing a forwarding address. This sudden disappearance was both relieving and concerning, as it meant David was no longer an immediate threat but also that his whereabouts were unknown. During the restraining order hearing, the judge reviewed all the evidence I had collected about David's behavior, including statements from Rebecca and the other parents who had experienced similar incidents. The judge granted a permanent restraining order and noted that David's sudden departure from the area suggested consciousness of guilt regarding his inappropriate conduct. The CPS investigation was also concluded around this time. The worker determined that the anonymous report had been unfounded and that Edith and Hannah were receiving appropriate care and support. She noted that the timing and content of the report, combined with the pattern of harassment I had documented, suggested it had likely been made in bad faith as a form of retaliation. However, the worker also recommended that I continue monitoring the girls' adjustment and consider counseling to help them process their experiences with David. She said children who had been subjected to manipulation by trusted adults often needed professional support to understand what had happened and rebuild their ability to trust appropriately. The most difficult part of this entire experience has been helping Edith and Hannah understand why David's behavior was inappropriate without completely destroying their faith in adult relationships. They still don't fully comprehend that David was manipulating them, and they continue to have positive memories of their time with him. I've had several age-appropriate conversations with them about recognizing when adults cross boundaries and the importance of telling me about any interactions that make them uncomfortable or confused. We've also discussed the difference between adults who genuinely care about children's well-being and those who have ulterior motives. The girls are gradually adjusting to life without dance classes, though they still occasionally express disappointment about not being able to continue their training. I've found a new dance studio in a neighboring town where they can resume lessons when they're ready, but I'm taking time to thoroughly research the instructors and policies before enrolling them anywhere new. Update 3: I thought the David situation was over when he disappeared from town, but recent developments have shown that his behavior was part of a much larger pattern, and that other families are still dealing with the consequences of his actions. Last month, I was contacted by a detective from a neighboring county who was investigating David Lee in connection with similar incidents involving children at dance studios in 3 different towns. The detective explained that David had been using the same tactics in multiple locations, targeting single mothers with young children who were enrolled in his dance programs. The detective had been contacted by parents in 2 other towns who had filed police reports about David's inappropriate behavior toward their families. In each case, the pattern was nearly identical to what I had experienced. David would identify vulnerable families, gradually insert himself into their lives, work to undermine parental authority, and then escalate his involvement until parents became uncomfortable enough to remove their children from his programs. What made David's behavior particularly concerning was his systematic approach to gathering information about families and his persistence in maintaining contact even after professional relationships had ended. The detective said this level of calculated manipulation suggested David posed a genuine threat to child safety and that his sudden disappearances from communities indicated he was aware his behavior was criminal. The investigation revealed that David had been operating dance studios under slightly different names in various locations over the past 7 years. In each location, he would establish himself as a reputable instructor, build relationships with local families, and then begin targeting specific children who fit his preferred profile. When parents complained or removed their children, David would either escalate his harassment or suddenly close his studio and move to a new area. Most disturbing was the discovery that David had been collecting detailed files on the families he targeted, including photographs, personal information, and notes about children's vulnerabilities and family dynamics. These files were found in a storage unit David had rented under a false name, and they contained information about dozens of children from multiple states. The detective asked if I would be willing to testify in a criminal case against David if he was located and arrested. I agreed immediately, both because I wanted justice for what had happened to my family and because I hoped it would prevent other families from experiencing similar trauma. 2 weeks after my conversation with the detective, David was arrested in a small town about 4 hours away where he had opened another dance studio. Parents there had recognized his behavior patterns from news coverage of the investigation and had contacted authorities before the situation could escalate as far as it had in previous locations. David has been charged with multiple counts of stalking, harassment, and child endangerment across several jurisdictions. The prosecutor handling the case explained that David's systematic approach to targeting families and his collection of detailed personal information could result in additional charges related to identity theft and violation of privacy laws. The legal proceedings are still ongoing, but I've been told that the evidence against David is substantial and that he will likely face significant prison time if convicted. More importantly, his arrest has been widely covered in local media, which should prevent him from targeting additional families in the future. Meanwhile, Edith and Hannah have made significant progress in understanding what happened during their time with David. I finally decided to seek counseling for them after the detective's investigation revealed the extent of David's manipulation tactics. The counselor has been helpful in explaining to the girls how David used specific techniques to influence their thoughts and feelings, and why his behavior was harmful even though it didn't seem obviously wrong at the time. The girls are now able to recognize that David's interest in them was inappropriate and that his attempts to undermine my authority were part of a deliberate strategy rather than genuine concern for their well-being. They've also learned to identify warning signs of similar manipulation tactics, which will help protect them from future predators. We enrolled at the new dance studio I had researched, and both girls are enjoying their classes there. The new instructor maintains appropriate boundaries, communicates only with parents rather than directly with students, and has clear policies about student-teacher interactions that make parents feel secure about their children's safety. The most significant change has been in my own awareness of how predators operate and the importance of trusting parental instincts even when behavior seems borderline appropriate. I've become more vigilant about monitoring the adults who have access to my children, and I'm quicker to speak up when something feels wrong rather than second-guessing myself. I've also connected with other parents who were affected by David's behavior, and we've formed an informal support network for sharing information about child safety and recognizing warning signs of inappropriate adult-child relationships. Rebecca Martinez and I have spoken at several parent education events about our experiences, hoping to help other families avoid similar situations. The most important lesson I've learned is that predators often target families who are already dealing with stress or transitions, because these circumstances make parents more likely to welcome additional support and less likely to question inappropriate behavior. Single parents, families who have recently moved, and parents dealing with financial or personal challenges are particularly vulnerable to this type of manipulation. I want other parents to know that if something feels wrong about an adult's interest in your child, it probably is wrong, even if you can't articulate exactly why. Trust your instincts, document concerning behavior, and don't hesitate to remove your child from situations that make you uncomfortable. It's better to overreact to a legitimate mentor than to ignore red flags from a predator. David's case is scheduled to go to trial next year, and I plan to testify about his impact on our family. While I wish we had never had to go through this experience, I'm grateful that speaking up helped protect other children from David's manipulation and that his pattern of behavior has finally been stopped. Edith and Hannah are thriving now, and they've learned valuable lessons about recognizing and responding to inappropriate adult behavior. Most importantly, they understand that adults who try to undermine their relationship with their parents or encourage them to keep secrets are not trustworthy, regardless of how caring or supportive they might seem.